Some people believe we're all just one bad break away from losing everything. For Thomas Mitchell, that break came 3 years ago when the factory closed, taking his job, his home, and his hope with it. Now 62 and living on the streets, Thomas spent his days on a park bench by the Hudson River, watching life pass him by. On this cold February afternoon, he was nursing his last cup of coffee when he heard a child screaming from the water below. A little girl was drowning in the icy river, her pink coat dragging her down. Thomas didn't hesitate. Despite his age and worn-out body, he jumped in and pulled her to safety. What he didn't know was that this 8-year-old girl was the heir to one of America's wealthiest families. Within hours, black cars surrounded the area, and Thomas learned that his simple act of courage had just changed both their lives forever. The child's billionaire father wanted to repay him, but Thomas had spent years believing he was worthless. Could saving one small life teach him that he still mattered? And could a man who had lost everything find the family he never knew he needed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The shelter coffee was always bitter, but Thomas Mitchell had learned to find comfort in small certainties. At 5:30 each morning, he would shuffle to the kitchen at St. Mary's, wrap his weathered hands around the cracked ceramic mug, and breathe in the steam that rose like morning prayers. It was ritual, routine, dignity, in a world that had stripped most of it away. 3 years ago, Thomas had been Thomas Mitchell, floor supervisor, Riverside Manufacturing. He'd worn press shirts, carried a lunch pail Margaret had packed with care, and drove a reliable pickup truck to a job where younger men sought his advice. He'd been somebody then. Now, at 62, with silver stubble and clothes that hung loose on his shrinking frame, he was just another face in the line for soup, another body on a cot, another statistic in a problem most people preferred not to see. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. First came the rumors about the plant closing, whispers that grew louder until they became headlines in the local paper. Riverside Manufacturing, cornerstone of their small town for 47 years, would be moving operations to Mexico. Thomas had worked there for 26 years, climbing from assembly line worker to floor supervisor, earning respect through competence and kindness. He'd trained hundreds of younger workers, settled disputes, solved problems that stumped engineers. His hands knew every machine, every sound that meant trouble, every shortcut that could save the company money. When the closure became official, they offered him a package: severance pay, extended health benefits, help with job placement. It seemed generous until Margaret got sick. The photograph in his wallet was worn soft from handling. Margaret on their wedding day, radiant in white lace, her eyes bright with dreams they'd planned to chase together. They'd married young, bought a modest house with good bones and a garden where Margaret grew tomatoes and roses with equal passion. They'd tried for children, but God had other plans. Instead, they'd poured their love into each other, into their home, into the life they built with careful hands and patient hearts. Cancer came like a thief. First, the fatigue that Margaret blamed on her job at the library. Then the lump she discovered one morning in the shower, small as a marble but heavy as a stone. The doctors spoke in percentages and treatment options, but Thomas heard only one thing: there was hope. If they could afford to fight, the experimental treatment wasn't covered by insurance. The specialists, the medications, the travel to the research hospital 3 states away, it all cost more than Thomas made in 2 years. He mortgaged the house, cashed out his retirement, sold Margaret's grandmother's china and his father's tools. When that wasn't enough, he sold the pickup truck and took 2 part-time jobs, working 18-hour days to pay for another round of treatments. Another month of hope got Margaret fought for 3 years with the same quiet determination she'd brought to everything else. She never complained about the treatments that left her weak and nauseated. Never blamed Thomas for the sleepless nights he spent balancing checkbooks and calculating how many more months they could afford to keep trying. She just held his hand and said, "We'll figure it out together, just like we always have." In the end, it wasn't enough. Margaret died on a Tuesday morning in October, holding Thomas's hand while autumn light filtered through hospital windows. Her last words were an apology for the bills, for the debt, for leaving him alone with nothing but an empty house and a mountain of medical expenses. Thomas had fought to keep the house for 6 months after the funeral, working 3 jobs and sleeping 4 hours a night. But the mortgage company and the medical creditors were relentless, and pride couldn't pay interest on crushing debt. He lost the house on a Friday afternoon in March, signing papers with hands that shook from exhaustion and grief. Father Miguel found him sleeping in his car outside St. Mary's Catholic Church the next morning. Miguel Torres had been running the church's homeless outreach program for 15 years, and he recognized the particular despair of someone who'd lost everything through no fault of their own. He didn't ask questions or offer empty platitudes. He just brought Thomas a cup of coffee and said, "There's a cot inside if you need it. No strings attached." That was 2.5 years ago. Thomas had become a fixture at St. Mary's, helping with repairs and maintenance in exchange for meals and a place to sleep. His mechanical skills, honed through decades at the factory, made him valuable in a place that ran on donated equipment and improvised solutions. He fixed the ancient boiler, repaired broken cots, and kept the kitchen appliances running with spare parts salvaged from dumpsters and clever engineering. But he still felt like a ghost, invisible to the world that had once valued his contributions. People looked through him on the street, stepped around him on sidewalks, avoided eye contact when he sat on his bench by the river. He wasn't dangerous or demanding. He never panhandled, never caused trouble, never raised his voice or made scenes. He was just there, like furniture someone had forgotten to move. The park bench had become his sanctuary. Overlooking the Hudson River, it offered a view of the old stone bridge where couples took wedding photos and families fed ducks on Sunday afternoons. Thomas would sit there for hours, watching the water flow past and remembering what it felt like to matter. Sometimes he'd pull out Margaret's photograph and tell her about his day, about the small kindnesses Father Miguel showed him, about the dreams they'd shared and the life they'd built and lost. Other homeless individuals had their own routines, their own ways of surviving. There was Danny, a Vietnam veteran whose mind sometimes forgot which war he was fighting. Sarah, a young woman who'd aged out of foster care with no family to catch her fall. Old Pete, who'd been on the street so long he'd forgotten his real name and answered only to the one painted on his shopping cart. They formed a loose community of the displaced, sharing information about warm places to sleep and which restaurants threw away the best food. Father Miguel tried to convince Thomas to apply for permanent housing assistance, to use the programs designed to help people get back on their feet. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't deserve help when so many others had greater needs. Danny had nightmares that left him screaming. Sarah was barely 20 and still had a lifetime to rebuild. Pete had been forgotten by a system that had failed him decades ago. Thomas had lived a good life, had known love and purpose and the satisfaction of useful work. If this was how his story ended, sitting on a bench with his memories and his grief, at least he'd had more than many. But on this February afternoon, nursing his coffee and watching the gray water flow beneath the bridge, Thomas Mitchell had no idea that his story was far from over. The little girl in the pink coat was already walking toward the riverbank with her nanny, already about to trip on the icy path, already about to fall into water that would change both their lives forever. The coffee had gone cold in his hands, but Thomas didn't notice. He was lost in memories of Margaret's laugh, the sound of her humming while she worked in their garden, The way she'd curl against him on cold mornings and whisper plans for their future. He was remembering what it felt like to be needed, what it felt like to be loved, what it felt like to be somebody who mattered in the world. That's when he heard the scream. The scream cut through the February air like breaking glass. Thomas's head snapped up from the cold coffee in his hands, his body responding before his mind could process what he was hearing. It was a child's voice, high and desperate, the kind of sound that bypassed logic and struck directly at the heart. He was on his feet before he realized he'd moved, his arthritic knees protesting as he stumbled toward the riverbank. The coffee cup hit the ground behind him, ceramic shattering on cold stone. But Thomas was already running, or what passed for running when you were 62, and hadn't had a proper meal in days. There, 20 feet below the walking path, a little girl thrashed in the icy Hudson River. Her pink winter coat had soaked through, the heavy fabric dragging her down despite her frantic efforts to stay afloat. Her dark hair was plastered to her head, and her small face kept disappearing beneath the surface before she managed to fight her way back up, gasping and choking. "Help!" she screamed again, her voice already weaker than before. "Somebody help me." Thomas could see she was losing the battle. The current was strong, pulling her away from the bank toward deeper water. Her movements were becoming less coordinated, her head going under for longer stretches. In minutes, maybe less, she would be gone. Other people were noticing now. A jogger had stopped on the path above, pulling out his phone. A woman with a stroller was shouting for someone to call 911, but they were all just watching, frozen by the practical realities of winter water and the certainty that jumping in would likely mean 2 deaths instead of 1. Thomas didn't think about the odds. He didn't calculate his chances or consider the wisdom of a homeless man with bad knees and an empty stomach diving into a river that could kill him. He just saw a child who was about to die, and his body moved without permission from his brain. He kicked off his worn boots and peeled away his heavy coat, his hands shaking from cold and adrenaline. The little girl went under again, stayed down longer this time. When she surfaced, her movements were weaker, her cries more desperate. "Hold on, sweetheart," Thomas shouted as he climbed over the stone barrier. "I'm coming!" The water was a shock. That drove the breath from his lungs and sent ice through his veins. The Hudson in February was deadly cold, the kind of temperature that could stop a heart or seize muscles in seconds. Thomas felt his body lock up, his limbs going rigid as the cold attacked every nerve ending. But the little girl was sinking again, her pink coat like a beacon beneath the dark surface. Thomas forced his arms to move, his legs to kick, his body to respond despite the cold that wanted to shut him down. He'd been a decent swimmer once, back when he and Margaret had taken weekend trips to the lake. But that was 20 years ago. And his body was softer now, slower, worn down by stress and poor nutrition. The current was stronger than he'd expected, trying to carry him downstream, even as he fought to reach the child. His lungs burned from the cold air. His muscles screamed protests with each stroke. But he could see her now, just a few feet away, her small body limp in the water. Thomas lunged forward and caught her arm just as she was going under again. She was heavier than he'd expected. The waterlogged coat had turned into an anchor, but he managed to wrap his arm around her chest and pull her against him. She was unconscious now, her face blue with cold, her body frighteningly still. I've got you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "I've got you, baby girl." Getting back to shore was the hardest thing Thomas had ever done. The cold had sapped his strength, and the extra weight of the child made every movement a battle. The current kept trying to pull them downstream, toward the deeper water where they would both disappear forever. His legs felt like concrete, his arms like lead. Twice he went under himself, swallowing mouthfuls of the bitter river water. But somehow, muscle memory from his factory days kicked in the stubborn. Determination that had gotten him through 26 years of 12-hour shifts and impossible deadlines. He focused on small goals. Reach that piece of debris. Make it to that spot where the current was weaker. Get close enough to touch bottom. One stroke at a time, one breath at a time, one heartbeat at a time. When his feet finally touched the muddy riverbank, Thomas had no strength left to climb out. He managed to push the little girl up onto the concrete ledge, then collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving, his whole body shaking with cold and exhaustion. The child lay motionless on the cold stone, water streaming from her clothes and... "Heir, please," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please breathe." He hauled himself out of the water on shaking arms and crawled to her side. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as paper. Thomas had no medical training, but he'd seen enough safety demonstrations at the factory to know the basics. He tilted her head back, checked her airway, and began pushing on her chest the way he'd seen in movies. "Come on, sweetheart," he pleaded, his hands shaking as he tried to remember the rhythm. "Come on back to us." After what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, the little girl coughed up river water and gasped. Her eyes fluttered open brown eyes, deep and scared but beautifully alive. She looked up at Thomas with confusion and terror, but also something else. Recognition, maybe. Gratitude. "It's okay," Thomas said, pulling off his soaked shirt to wrap around her. "You're safe now. I've got you." The little girl tried to speak, but could only cough up more water. Thomas held her against his chest, sharing what little warmth his body had left, and looked up to see a crowd gathering on the path above. Someone was shouting instructions into a phone. Someone else was climbing down toward them with a blanket. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Thomas asked gently, brushing wet hair from her face. "Sophia," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My name is Sophia." "That's a beautiful name," Thomas said. "I'm Thomas." "Everything's going to be okay, Sophia. Help is coming." But even as he said it, Thomas could feel consciousness slipping away from him. The cold and exhaustion were too much for his worn-out body. The last thing he remembered before the darkness took him was Sophia's small hand gripping his fingers, and her voice, stronger now, calling him her angel. When the paramedics arrived 5 minutes later, they found an unconscious homeless man and a little girl in a pink coat who refused to let go of his hand. She kept telling everyone who would listen that the angel man had saved her life, that he jumped into the cold water without thinking twice, that he was a hero. What none of them knew yet was that the little girl in the pink coat was Sophia Whitmore, the only child of technology billionaire James Whitmore, and that her rescue was about to become the biggest news story of the year. Thomas had dropped his mitten during the rescue, a small pink thing that would later be found frozen, to the concrete where he'd laid her down. It would become evidence, then a symbol, then a reminder of the moment when 2 lives changed forever. But for now, as the ambulances arrived and the media vans began to gather, Thomas Mitchell slept the deep sleep of exhaustion and hypothermia, unaware that he'd just saved the most important little girl in America. Thomas woke to the steady beep of hospital machines and antiseptic smell of industrial cleaning supplies. His body ached in places he'd forgotten he had, and his throat felt raw from swallowing river water. But he was warmer than he'd been in months, wrapped in heated blankets that made his fingers tingle as circulation returned. "You're awake." The voice belonged to a young nurse with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "How are you feeling, Mr. Mitchell?" "The little girl," Thomas croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "Sophia, is she?" "She's fine," the nurse assured him quickly. "Thanks to you. She's in pediatric recovery, asking for her angel man every few minutes." Thomas tried to sit up, but dizziness forced him back against the pillows. "I need to see her. Make sure she's really okay." "She is, I promise, but you need to rest." You've been unconscious for 6 hours. Severe hypothermia, exhaustion, mild dehydration. You're lucky to be alive." Before Thomas could respond, the door opened and Father Miguel stepped in, his weathered face creased with concern and relief. Behind him came a man Thomas didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of expensive haircut that spoke of wealth and power. The stranger's eyes were red-rimmed, and his hand shook slightly as he approached the bed. "Thomas," Father Miguel said softly, "this is James Whitmore, Sophia's father." James Whitmore looked like he belonged in boardrooms and country clubs, not hospital rooms that smelled of disinfectant and desperation. His suit probably cost more than Thomas had made in his last year at the factory. But when he looked at Thomas, there was nothing but raw gratitude in his eyes. "Mr. Mitchell, James," sobbed, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my daughter's life." Thomas shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the man's stare. Anyone would have done the same thing. "No," James said firmly. "They wouldn't have. There were a dozen people on that path, and they all just watched. You're the only one who jumped." The door opened again, and a small figure in a hospital gown burst in, followed by a flustered-looking doctor. Sophia Whitmore looked tiny in the oversized gown, her dark hair brushed and shining, her brown eyes bright with excitement and relief. "Angel Man!" she cried, running to Thomas's bedside before anyone could stop her. "You're awake. Daddy, it's him. It's my Angel Man." Thomas felt his throat tighten as the little girl climbed carefully onto the edge of his bed, her small hand finding his. She was real, alive, warm to the touch. The blue lips and pale skin from the river were gone, replaced by rosy cheeks and sparkling eyes. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Thomas asked gently. "I'm okay, but I was scared you weren't going to wake up," Sophia said seriously. "The doctor said you were very cold. I made you something." She pulled a piece of paper from her gown pocket and unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing done in crayon stick figures by a river, one large figure jumping toward a smaller one. In the water, at the top, in shaky letters, she'd written, "Thank you for saving me, Angel Man. Love, Sophia." Thomas stared at the drawing, his vision blurring with tears he hadn't expected. It had been so long since anyone had made something just for him, since anyone had thought he was worth the effort of careful crayon strokes and crooked letters. "This is beautiful," he whispered. "Thank you, Sophia. I wanted to give you something because you gave me my life back," she said matter-of-factly, with the profound simplicity that only children possess. James Whitmore watched the interaction with something like wonder in his eyes. "Sophia," he said gently, "we should let Mr. Mitchell rest now." "But I want to stay with him," Sophia protested. "What if he needs something? What if he gets scared?" Thomas felt something crack open in his chest at the child's concern. When was the last time someone had worried about him being scared or needing something? When was the last time someone had seen him as worth protecting? "I'll be okay," Thomas assured her. "The doctors are taking good care of me." James stepped closer to the bed, his businessman's composure struggling with raw emotion. "Mr. Mitchell, I want to do something for you. Anything. Name it, and it's yours." Thomas shook his head. "I don't need anything. Just knowing she's safe is enough. But you lost everything jumping in that river. Your coat, your boots, things," Thomas said quietly. "Just things. She's what matters." James seemed taken aback by the response. In his world, everything had a price. Every favor required payment. But this homeless man who'd risked his life for a stranger's child wanted nothing in return. "At least let me replace what you lost," James insisted, "and cover your medical bills. It's the least I can do." Before Thomas could protest, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. Through the open door, they could see camera crews setting up, reporters checking their microphones, photographers adjusting their lenses. They found out, Father Miguel said grimly. About the rescue, about who Sophia is. It's all over the news. James's face hardened. His security team would have briefed him on the media attention, the headlines calling it a miracle rescue. The story of the homeless hero who saved the billionaire's daughter. In his experience, sudden fame brought opportunists and people looking to profit from tragedy. But looking at Thomas, genuinely exhausted, uncomfortable with attention, more concerned about Sophia's well-being than his own newfound notoriety, James saw only sincerity. The media will want to interview you, James warned. They'll want to turn this into a story. I don't want to talk to reporters, Thomas said quickly. I just want to make sure Sophia's okay and then get back to my life. What life? The question came out harsher than James intended, but it hung in the air between them. What did Thomas have to go back to? A cot in a shelter? A park bench by the river? The daily struggle to survive on society's margins? Thomas flinched at the words, but didn't argue. It was a fair question, after all. What kind of life was he returning to? Sophia seemed to sense the tension. She squeezed Thomas's hand tighter and looked up at her father with determined eyes. Daddy, she said seriously, can we keep him? The question hung in the hospital room like morning mist, innocent and profound all at once. James felt his breath catch as he looked between his daughter's earnest face and Thomas's startled expression. Out of the mouths of babes came truths that adults spent lifetimes learning to avoid. Sweetheart, James said carefully, Mr. Mitchell has his own life, his own plans. But he doesn't. Sophia interrupted with the brutal honesty of childhood. The nurses said he lives in a shelter. That means he doesn't have a home. We have lots of rooms. Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. The shame of his circumstances lay bare by an 8-year-old's logic. Around his neck, hidden beneath the hospital gown, Margaret's wedding ring hung on its chain, the only thing of value he'd managed to keep through 3 years of loss. He touched it now, drawing comfort from the familiar weight against his chest. Sophia, he said gently, your Daddy's right. I have a place to stay, people who care about me. Father Miguel has been very kind. But James was studying Thomas with the calculating gaze that had made him billions in the tech industry. He saw the way the older man's hand moved to his throat, the protective gesture that spoke of something precious hidden there. He saw the dignity maintained despite circumstances that would have broken most people. Most importantly, he saw how Sophia looked at Thomas, not with pity or curiosity, but with pure affection. His daughter had been different since her mother's death 2 years ago. Quieter, more cautious, clinging to James with a desperation that broke his heart daily. Elena's death in the car accident had shattered both their worlds, leaving James to navigate single parenthood in a house that felt too big and too empty. Sophia had nightmares, saw therapists, attended grief counseling sessions where she nodded politely and said the right words but never truly healed Dot until now. Looking at her perched on Thomas's hospital bed, animated and engaged in a way James hadn't seen since before the accident, he felt something shift in his chest. Mr. Mitchell, James said slowly, may I speak with you privately? Father Miguel squeezed Thomas's shoulder. I'll take Sophia to get some ice cream from the cafeteria. Give you men a chance to talk. Can I come back? Sophia asked Thomas seriously. If your daddy says it's okay, I'd like that very much. After they left, James pulled a chair close to Thomas's bed. Up close, Thomas could see the exhaustion in the younger man's eyes, the weight of grief and responsibility that money couldn't ease. My wife died 2 years ago, James said without preamble. Car accident on the way home from Sophia's school play. Since then, it's been just the two of us, and I've been failing her every day. Thomas frowned. That little girl adores you. I can see it in how she looks at you. She's afraid to let me out of her sight, James corrected. She's lost one parent. So she's terrified of losing the other. I've hired the best therapists, tried everything the experts recommend, but she's still scared all the time. Except, he gestured toward the door where Sophia had disappeared. Except when she's with you. In the few minutes you've been awake, I've seen more joy in her face than I have in months. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. She's been through trauma. Sometimes talking to a stranger feels safer than talking to someone you might lose. Maybe, James said. Or maybe she recognizes something in you that I'm just beginning to see. You risked your life for her without knowing who she was, without expecting anything in return. When was the last time someone did something for her for either of us without wanting something back? The honesty in James's voice was startling. Thomas had assumed that wealth insulated people from the kind of pain he knew. But looking at this father's haunted eyes, he realized that some losses couldn't be bought or sold. Mr. Whitmore, Thomas said carefully, I'm grateful for everything you want to do, but I'm not the kind of person who belongs in your world. I'm a homeless man who couldn't even keep his own life together. What happened? James asked quietly. How did you end up on the streets? Thomas found himself telling the story, Margaret's illness, the medical bills, the choices that had seemed so clear at the time. James listened without judgment, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. You bankrupted yourself to save your wife's life, James said when Thomas finished. I couldn't save her anyway, Thomas replied, his voice hollow. But you tried. You sacrificed everything to give her a chance. James leaned forward. Do you know what most people do when faced with that choice? They look for ways to protect their assets, find loopholes, preserve their security. You chose love over security, hope over prudence. That's not failure, Mr. Mitchell. That's heroism. Thomas touched Margaret's ring again, feeling the warm gold against his fingertips. Your daughter called me an angel, but I'm not. I'm just a broken-down old man who's lost everything worth having. Are you? James stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. Because from where I stand, you're a man who's twice now put someone else's life before your own comfort. First with your wife, now with my daughter. That's not broken, Thomas. That's whole in a way most people never achieve. The use of his first name felt like a bridge being built between them, but Thomas wasn't sure he was ready to cross it. What are you asking me? He said finally. James turned back to face him. Stay. Not forever, not as charity, but as family. Sophia needs a grandfather figure, someone who's lived enough life to offer wisdom without judgment. And honestly, I could use the guidance too. I made my fortune by calculating risks and maximizing returns, but I don't know how to help a little girl heal from losing her mother. I don't know anything about raising children, Thomas protested. Neither do I, apparently. But you know about loss, about choosing love over fear, about getting up every morning, even when everything seems hopeless. Those are the lessons Sophia needs to learn. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the offer settle over him. A home, a family, a purpose beyond mere survival. It was everything he'd thought he'd lost forever when Margaret died. I wouldn't know how to live in your world, he said quietly. Then teach us how to live in yours, James replied. Teach us what really matters, what's worth fighting for, what's worth saving. Teach my daughter that heroes don't wear capes. They wear worn-out coats and carry coffee in cracked mugs and jump into freezing rivers because someone needs help. When Father Miguel returned with Sophia, they found both men sitting in thoughtful silence. Sophia immediately climbed back onto Thomas's bed, settling against his side like she belonged there. Did you decide? She asked with 8-year-old directness. Thomas looked down at her trusting face, then up at James's hopeful expression. Margaret's ring seemed to pulse against his chest, and he could almost hear her voice whispering the advice she'd given him through 26 years of marriage. Follow your heart, Thomas. It's never led us wrong yet. "I'd like to try," he said quietly. "If you're sure you want an old homeless man learning how to be part of your family." Sophia threw her arms around his neck. "You're not homeless anymore," she said matter-of-factly. "You're home." The Whitmore estate sat behind iron gates, like something from a movie Thomas had never imagined himself entering. As James's car wound up the circular drive, Thomas pressed his face to the window like a child, taking in manicured lawns, sculpted hedges, and a house that seemed to stretch on forever. His new clothes, purchased by James during his recovery, felt strange and stiff, a costume he wasn't sure he deserved to wear. "It's too much," he murmured, more to himself than to his companions. "Wait until you see the inside," Sophia said from beside him, bouncing with excitement. "We have a library with a ladder that rolls, and a kitchen bigger than some houses, and a room just for watching movies." James caught Thomas's expression in the rearview mirror. "The guest house is separate," he said gently. "Private. You'll have your own space, your own entrance. No pressure to be part of the main house routine unless you want to be." But Thomas barely heard him. His attention had been caught by a small structure near the garden, a greenhouse with several broken windows and a door hanging askew on its hinges. Through the glass, he could see overturned pots and dead plants, a space that had once been cared for but now sat abandoned. "What happened there?" he asked, pointing. James's hands tightened on the steering wheel. That was Elena's greenhouse. She loved gardening, spent hours in there with her orchids and herbs. "After she died, I couldn't." He cleared his throat. "I should probably have it torn down." "Can I fix it?" The words came out before Thomas could stop them. "Daddy, yes." Sophia clapped her hands. "Mr. Thomas can make it beautiful again, like Mommy would have wanted." James parked in front of the guest house, a charming cottage that was larger than the home Thomas had shared with Margaret. "You don't have to fix anything," James said. "You're here as family, not as hired help." But Thomas was already studying the greenhouse through the car window, his mechanic's eye cataloging what would need to be repaired. "I'd like to try," he said quietly, "if that's okay. I'm not good at sitting idle." The guest house was a revelation. Hardwood floors gleamed under soft lighting, and the furniture looked like it had never been used. There was a full kitchen, a bedroom with a bed bigger than any Thomas had ever slept in, and a living room with windows overlooking the garden. It was more space than he knew what to do with, more luxury than he'd ever dreamed of having. "The staff will bring meals if you want," James explained, "or you can cook for yourself, whatever feels comfortable." Thomas nodded, overwhelmed by the kindness and the strangeness of his new reality. 3 days ago, he'd been sleeping on a cot in a shelter. Now he was standing in accommodations nicer than the home he'd lost. "Mr. Thomas," Sophia said, tugging on his sleeve, "want to see my room? It's in the big house, but you can visit whenever you want." The main house was even more impressive inside. Thomas felt like he was walking through a museum, afraid to touch anything that might be priceless. Sophia led him through hallways lined with artwork, past rooms that seemed to serve no purpose other than looking beautiful. Her bedroom was a little girl's dream, pink and purple, with a canopy bed, more toys than she could play with in a lifetime, and a window seat overlooking the garden. But what caught Thomas's attention was a small music box on her dresser, its delicate ballerina frozen mid-spin. "It's broken," Sophia said sadly, following his gaze. "It was Mommy's when she was little. Daddy says maybe we can get someone to fix it, but it plays her favorite song, and I'm scared they might change it." Thomas approached the music box carefully, his practiced hands already assessing the problem. The mechanism was visible through a crack in the base. A few gears had come loose, probably from being dropped or overwound. "May I?" he asked gently. Sophia nodded, watching with wide eyes as Thomas examined the delicate machinery. His fingers rough from years of manual labor, but steady from decades of precision work, located the problem immediately. One gear had slipped off its post, jamming the entire mechanism. "I think I can fix this," he said. "But I'd need some small tools, maybe a magnifying glass." "Really?" Sophia's face lit up with hope. "You could make it play Mommy's song again." "I'll try my best." James appeared in the doorway, having watched the interaction with growing amazement. This man, who'd been living in a shelter, was examining an antique music box with the expertise of a trained craftsman. "You know about mechanical repair?" James asked. 26 years at Riverside Manufacturing," Thomas replied, still focused on the music box. "You learn to fix things when replacement parts cost more than your daily wage." That afternoon, James provided the tools Thomas requested, along with a magnifying glass and a well-lit workspace in the main house's sunroom. Sophia sat beside him, fascinated as he carefully disassembled the music box with the patience of a surgeon. "My daddy fixes things too," she said, "but he fixes them with computers. He says he can't fix anything he can touch." Thomas smiled at that. "Different kinds of fixing, I suppose." "Your daddy fixes problems for millions of people with his computers. I just fix small things, one at a time. But small things matter too, right?" "Sometimes the small things matter most." As Thomas worked, Sophia chattered about her mother, how Elena had loved the music box, how she'd wind it up every night before bedtime, how the song always made Sophia feel safe. She spoke about the greenhouse too, describing the flowers her mother had grown, the way Elena had taught her the names of different plants, the tea parties they'd had among the orchids. "Daddy won't go in there anymore," Sophia said quietly. "I think it makes him too sad." Thomas looked up from his delicate work. "Sometimes when we love someone very much, the places that remind us of them hurt too much to visit. But that doesn't mean your daddy loved your mommy any less. Do you have places like that?" Thomas thought of his old house, the kitchen where Margaret had hummed while cooking, the garden where she'd grown tomatoes and roses. "Yes," he said simply. "I do. Maybe someday we can visit them together," Sophia said with the matter-of-fact wisdom of children. "Sometimes scary things aren't so scary when you're not alone." After 2 hours of careful work, Thomas had the music box apart, its gears cleaned and properly aligned. The final step was the most delicate, threading the mainspring back into place without disturbing the carefully balanced mechanism. "Cross your fingers," he told Sophia as he prepared to test his repair. He wound the key gently, holding his breath as the mechanism engaged. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, sweet and clear, the familiar melody began to play. The tiny ballerina spun gracefully, her painted smile serene as she danced to Alana's favorite song. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears. She threw her arms around Thomas's neck, holding him tight. "You brought Mommy's song back," she whispered. "Thank you." James stood in the doorway, having been drawn by the sound of the music box. His own eyes were wet as he watched his daughter's joy. Listen to the melody that had filled their house every night before Elena's death. "How did you?" he began, then stopped. It didn't matter how. What mattered was that Thomas had given his daughter something precious back, had restored a connection to her mother that James had thought was lost forever. That evening, as Thomas settled into his guest house, he could hear the music box playing from Sophia's room across the garden. The sound carried on the night air like a lullaby, a reminder that sometimes the most important repairs weren't to broken machines, but to broken hearts. He pulled out Margaret's photograph, worn soft from handling, and spoke to her in the darkness. "I fixed something today, Maggie," he whispered. "A little girl's music box. But I think maybe it fixed something in me too." Outside his window, the broken greenhouse stood silhouetted against the stars, waiting for its own restoration. Thomas's days at the estate fell into a rhythm that surprised him with its natural ease. He woke at dawn old habits from the shelter. died hard, and made coffee in the small kitchen before walking the grounds as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. The estate was beautiful in the early morning, peaceful in a way that reminded him of the walks he'd taken with Margaret through their old neighborhood. Sophia would appear by 8 o'clock, usually still in her pajamas, drawn by some internal compass that told her where to find him. She'd appointed herself his assistant in all projects, carrying tools in a pink toolbox James had bought her, chattering about her dreams and asking questions that revealed a sharp mind behind her innocent observations. "Why do you wake up so early?" she asked one morning, finding him in the greenhouse where he'd been replacing broken panes of glass. "When you don't have much, you don't want to waste any of it," Thomas replied, measuring a new piece of glass against the frame. "Sleeping late feels like throwing away part of the day." "But now you have lots," Sophia pointed out. "You have a whole house and all the time you want." Thomas paused in his work, considering her words. "I suppose you're right. Maybe it's just become who I am." The greenhouse restoration had become his primary project, a labor of love that grew more meaningful with each repair. James had offered to hire contractors, but Thomas preferred working with his hands, taking satisfaction in each small improvement. He'd spent the first week simply sweeping out dead leaves, scrubbing years of grime from the glass, cataloging what could be saved and what needed replacement. As he worked, Sophia would share memories of her mother in this space. Elena had been a passionate gardener, someone who found peace among growing things. She'd taught Sophia the names of flowers in 3 languages, shown her how to coax orchids into bloom, explained the delicate balance that kept a greenhouse ecosystem thriving. "Mommy said plants are like people," Sophia told him one afternoon as they repotted a surviving orchid they'd found among the debris. "They need the right light, the right food, and lots of love to grow strong." "Your mommy sounds like she was." "Very wise," Thomas said, his hands gentle as he settled the plant into fresh soil. "She was, but sometimes I forget what her voice sounded like." Sophia's admission came quietly, tinged with the guilt children feel about forgetting. Thomas understood that particular pain. Sometimes he struggled to remember the exact sound of Margaret's laugh, the way she hummed off-key while gardening. Memory was imperfect, fading at the edges no matter how tightly you tried to hold on. "I have something that might help," he said, pulling his phone from his pocket. James had insisted he have one, though Thomas still felt awkward with the technology. "Your daddy showed me how to find videos on the internet. Would you like to see some of your mommy?" They spent the next hour watching clips from charity galas and business events where Elena had appeared alongside James, Sophia curled against Thomas's side, pointing out details in her mother's appearance, laughing at familiar expressions and gestures. "There," she said when Elena spoke in one video. "That's exactly how she sounded when she read me bedtime stories." James found them like that later, his daughter and the man who'd saved her sharing memories on a gardening bench, surrounded by newly repaired greenhouse windows. He'd been watching these interactions for weeks now, amazed by how naturally Thomas had settled into the role of grandfather figure. His own relationship with Sophia had begun to change too. Where once she'd clung to him with desperate anxiety, afraid he might disappear like her mother had, now she seemed more secure. Thomas's presence had created a buffer zone of safety, allowing Sophia to be a child again instead of a small person carrying too much worry. "How's the project coming?" James asked, surveying the transformed space. "Getting there," Thomas replied. "Should be ready for planting soon, if Sophia wants to try growing something." "Can we, Daddy?" Sophia's eyes lit up with excitement. "Can we grow flowers like Mommy did?" James felt his chest tighten at the mention of Elena, but the pain was softer, now mixed with something that might have been healing. "If that's what you'd like." That evening, after Sophia had gone to bed, James found Thomas in the guest house kitchen, reading a gardening book he'd borrowed from Elena's collection. The older man looked up when James knocked, closing the book with a finger marking his place. "I wanted to thank you," James said, accepting the cup of coffee Thomas offered. "For everything you're doing with Sophia, with the greenhouse. You didn't have to take on these projects." "I wanted to," Thomas replied simply. "It feels good to be useful again." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Two men from different worlds finding common ground in their care for the same little girl. "Can I ask you something?" James said finally. "The way you are with Sophia, so natural, so patient, did you and your wife ever want children?" Thomas's hand moved unconsciously to the chain around his neck. "We tried for years. Margaret went through treatments, procedures, hope followed by disappointment over and over. We finally accepted it wasn't meant to be. Do you regret it? Not having a family of your own?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I used to think I'd missed out on something essential. But watching Sophia these past weeks, I'm starting to think family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about choice, about who you decide to love and protect." James found himself thinking about his own family, the aunts and uncles who questioned Thomas's presence, who whispered concerns about his motives and background. They saw a homeless man taking advantage of a grieving widower's gratitude. They couldn't see what James saw, a man of quiet dignity who asked for nothing and gave everything. "My sister called today," James said. "She thinks I'm being naive, bringing a stranger into Sophia's life. She suggested I have you investigated more thoroughly." Thomas set down his coffee cup, his expression careful. "Maybe she's right. You don't really know me, what I might have done in my past. I know you jumped into a freezing river to save a child you'd never met," James replied. "I know you spent 3 weeks restoring my wife's greenhouse without being asked. I know my daughter hasn't had nightmares since you moved into the guest house. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." But Thomas could see the doubt creeping in, the reasonable caution of a father who'd already lost too much. "If you want me to leave, I don't," James said firmly. "But I want to understand something. Why are you really here? What do you get out of this arrangement?" The question hung between them, honest and necessary. Thomas looked out the window, toward the main house, where a soft light still glowed in Sophia's room. "I get to matter again," he said finally. "For 3 years, I've been invisible, disposable, someone people step around on the sidewalk. But when Sophia looks at me, I see myself the way I used to be, someone worth knowing, someone who can fix things and solve problems and make a difference. She gives me back my purpose." James felt something shift in his understanding of their arrangement. He'd thought he was helping Thomas by offering him a home, but maybe Thomas was helping him just as much, showing him how to be a father again, how to see past his own grief to what his daughter needed. "There's something else," James said quietly. "I found some of Elena's journals when I was looking for the gardening books. She wrote about wanting Sophia to have grandparents, extended family. We were both only children, and after our parents died, it was just us. Elena worried about what would happen if something happened to me too." He pulled a leather journal from his jacket pocket, its pages filled with Elena's careful handwriting. She wrote about hoping to find someone who could be a grandfather to Sophia, someone who would love her unconditionally and teach her things we couldn't. Reading it now, it's like she somehow knew you were coming. Thomas took the journal with reverent hands, scanning the passages James had marked. Elena's words spoke of love and fear, of a mother's desire to protect her child even beyond death. In the margins, she'd sketched plans for the greenhouse, noted which plants Sophia had helped her tend, recorded the small moments that make up a life. "She sounds like she was an extraordinary woman," Thomas said softly. "She was. And I think she would have loved having you here, would have trusted you with Sophia the way I'm learning to trust you." That night, Thomas sat in his small kitchen reading Elena's journal, learning about the woman whose greenhouse he was restoring, whose daughter he was helping to heal. The words painted a picture of someone not unlike Margaret Kind, thoughtful, devoted to family, finding joy in simple pleasures. As he prepared for bed, Thomas found himself thinking about the strange turns life could take. 6 months ago, he'd been a broken man with nothing left to lose. Now he was part of something bigger than himself, needed and valued in ways he'd forgotten were possible. Margaret's ring caught the lamplight as he pulled it from beneath his shirt, holding it up to study the worn gold band. "What do you think, Maggie?" he whispered. "Am I doing the right thing here?" Outside his window, the greenhouse stood restored and ready for new life, its clean windows reflecting the stars like promises of tomorrow's light. The private investigators. Report arrived on a Tuesday morning while Thomas was teaching Sophia how to transplant seedlings in the greenhouse. Margaret Chun had been thorough in her research. 3 weeks of digging through public records, interviewing former colleagues, reconstructing the life of Thomas Mitchell before he became the homeless hero of the headlines. James sat in his study, reading the file, his coffee growing cold as the scope of Thomas's sacrifice became clear. The medical records painted a devastating picture. Margaret Mitchell's cancer diagnosis, the experimental treatments that weren't covered by insurance, the mounting bills that had consumed a lifetime of savings in 18 months. But it was the bank records that truly humbled James. Thomas hadn't just spent his retirement savings. He'd mortgaged and lost his home, liquidated every asset, cashed out his pension early despite the penalties. The man who now lived in a guest house had once owned a modest but comfortable home, had savings accounts and investment portfolios, had built a solid middle-class life through decades of steady work. More revealing were the interviews with Thomas's former colleagues at Riverside Manufacturing. The picture they painted was of a man who'd been respected and admired, someone who'd trained hundreds of workers, solved complex manufacturing problems, and earned the kind of loyalty that money couldn't buy. "He was the guy you went to when nobody else could figure it out," said Frank Rodriguez, who'd worked under Thomas for 15 years. "Never lost his temper, never made you feel stupid for asking questions." When they closed the plant, grown men cried because they were losing Tom Mitchell more than they were losing their jobs. The investigator had also uncovered something else: Thomas's military service record from Vietnam, where he'd earned a Bronze Star for pulling wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. The pattern was clear: a lifetime of putting others before himself, of making sacrifices without expecting recognition. "Mr. Whitmore?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Your sister is here to see you." Victoria Whitmore Hamilton swept into James's study with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way. 2 years older than James and considerably more protective of the family's reputation, she'd been vocal in her concerns about Thomas from the beginning. "I assume you've read the report," she said without preamble, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "I have." "Then you understand why I'm concerned. This man has made a career of dramatic rescues. First in Vietnam, now with Sophia. Don't you find that suspicious?" James looked up from the file, incredulous. "You think he orchestrated Sophia's accident?" "I think desperate people do desperate things." A homeless man suddenly living in luxury, with access to one of the wealthiest families in America. The timing is convenient. Victoria, he was sitting on a park bench drinking coffee when she fell in. There were witnesses. "Or so it appears." Victoria leaned forward, her voice taking on the persuasive tone that had made her a formidable corporate lawyer. "James, you're vulnerable right now. Still grieving Elena, trying to be everything to Sophia. This man has manipulated those emotions perfectly." Before James could respond, voices drifted in from the garden. Through the window, they could see Thomas and Sophia working together in the greenhouse, the little girl's laughter bright as sunshine, as Thomas showed her how to water the new seedlings. "Look at her," James said quietly. "When was the last time you saw Sophia laugh like that before Thomas arrived?" "That's exactly my point." He's engineered this whole situation to make himself indispensable. Classic manipulation. James closed the investigator's report and looked at his sister with growing frustration. This report shows a man who bankrupted himself trying to save his wife's life. A war hero who risked his life for strangers. A supervisor who was beloved by his employees. How exactly does that add up to manipulation? Because that's what good con artists do. James, they create a history that makes them sympathetic, that explains away their current circumstances. Did you verify any of these stories independently? The question stung because James hadn't verified anything. He'd taken Thomas at face value, trusting his instincts rather than conducting due diligence. In business, that would have been foolish. In matters of the heart, it had felt right. Even if everything in this report is true, Victoria continued, it doesn't change the fact that he's homeless, that he has nothing to lose and everything to gain by ingratiating himself with your family. What happens when the novelty wears off? When Sophia gets tired of her new grandfather and he's left with nothing again? The conversation was interrupted by Sophia bursting through the study doors, her small hands dirty with soil, her face glowing with excitement. "Daddy, Aunt Victoria, you have to come see what me and Mr. Thomas planted. We have tomatoes and herbs," and she stopped mid-sentence, noticing the tension in the room. "What's wrong?" James forced a smile. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart. We were just talking about boring grown-up things." But Sophia was perceptive, and she caught the way Victoria was looking at the papers on James's desk. Is someone in trouble? No one's in trouble, James assured her, but Victoria spoke at the same time. "Sophia, honey, has Mr. Thomas ever asked you about your daddy's work? About money or business things?" Sophia frowned, confused by the question. "He asks if I'm happy, and if I had good dreams, and if I want to learn about plants." "Why? Just wondering," Victoria said with forced casualness. Sometimes adults ask children questions they shouldn't. "Mr. Thomas isn't like that," Sophia said, with fierce protectiveness. "He's good. He fixed Mommy's music box, and he's making her greenhouse beautiful again, and he tells me stories about when he was young." "Sophia," James interrupted gently, "why don't you go wash your hands? We'll come see the garden in a few minutes." After she left, Victoria shook her head. "You see how defensive she is? That's concerning, James. Children who are being groomed often protect their abusers." "Groomed?" James's voice was sharp with anger. "You're suggesting Thomas is. I'm suggesting you don't really know this man. And until you do, until you've verified every detail of his story, Sophia is potentially at risk." That evening, James found himself watching Thomas with new eyes. The older man was reading to Sophia in the living room, both of them curled up on the sofa with a children's book about gardening. Sophia was half asleep against Thomas's shoulder, secure and content in a way she hadn't been since Elena's death. Everything about the scene spoke of genuine affection, of a man who'd found unexpected purpose in caring for a grieving child. But Victoria's words had planted seeds of doubt, questions that gnawed at James's certainty. After Sophia went to bed, James approached Thomas in the guest house, the investigator's report tucked under his arm. "We need to talk," he said. Thomas looked up from Elena's journal, which had become his nightly reading. He saw the paper in James's hand and the careful distance in his expression. "You have me investigated," Thomas said. "It wasn't a question. My sister insisted." "She thinks—" James stopped, unsure how to voice Victoria's accusations without sounding paranoid. "She thinks I'm running some kind of con," Thomas finished. "That I'm taking advantage of your grief and Sophia's need for family." The accuracy of the assessment surprised James. "How did you?" "Because I'd think the same thing if I were in your position." Thomas set down the journal and faced James directly. "A homeless man suddenly living in luxury with access to your daughter. your life, your fortune. It looks suspicious. The report shows you were a war hero, a respected supervisor, but you lost everything trying to save your wife. If that's all true, it is true, Thomas said quietly. Every word, but I understand why you need to verify it. James felt uncomfortable under Thomas's steady gaze. The older man's calm acceptance of the investigation made Victoria's paranoia seem misplaced, but it also raised new questions. Why? Aren't you angry? James asked. Most people would be offended by having their backgrounds checked. Because I know what I look like from the outside, Thomas replied. And because I understand that you're protecting your daughter. I do the same thing in your position. Would you be willing to submit to a polygraph? To answer any questions we have. If that's what it takes for you to trust me around Sophia, yes. The easy agreement should have been reassuring, but it left James feeling more conflicted than before. Either Thomas was exactly what he appeared to be, a good man who'd suffered devastating losses, or he was sophisticated enough to manipulate even polygraph tests. There's something else, James said, his voice carefully neutral. Victoria thinks the timing of your appearance in our lives is too convenient. That maybe Sophia's accident wasn't entirely accidental. For the first time, Thomas's composure cracked. His face went pale, and his hands trembled as he set down his coffee cup. You think I pushed her in, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to think anymore. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on his hands. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with pain. I was thinking about Margaret when I heard Sophia scream, remembering our last morning together, how she'd made me promise to keep living even after she was gone. I almost didn't jump, James. For a split second, I thought about how easy it would be to just let the cold water take me too. He looked up, meeting James's eyes directly. But then I saw that little girl fighting for her life, and I couldn't live with letting another person I might have saved slip away. So I jumped. Not because I planned it, not because I saw an opportunity. I jumped because I couldn't bear to lose someone else. The raw honesty in Thomas's voice was devastating. James felt his certainty crumbling, replaced by shame at having doubted a man who'd given him so much. I'm sorry, James said. I had to ask. No, Thomas replied. You had to protect your daughter. That's what good fathers do. The medical records from Margaret's treatment sat on the table, between them like evidence of a man's character written in dollars and sacrifice. They told a story Victoria refused to see, not of manipulation, but of love so deep it had cost Thomas everything he owned. What do you want me to do? Thomas asked. If you need me to leave, I don't want you to leave, James said quickly. But I need to know for certain who you are, what your intentions are. Not just for my peace of mind, but for Sophia's safety. Thomas nodded slowly. Then let's verify everything. Every story, every detail, every claim I've made. When you're satisfied that I am who I say I am, we can decide what comes next. As James left the guest house that night, he carried with him the weight of doubt and the burden of protection. The man who'd saved his daughter had agreed to bear his entire life to scrutiny, not out of guilt or desperation, but out of love for the child they both wanted to protect. The truth, whatever it might be, would change everything. The verification process began the next morning with Father Miguel's visit to the estate. James had called St. Mary's Shelter, and the priest had agreed to drive up from the city to speak about Thomas's character and history. He arrived in an old sedan that looked out of place among the luxury cars in the Whitmore driveway, but his presence brought an immediate sense of authenticity to the proceedings. Thomas is one of the finest men I've ever known, Father Miguel told James as they sat in the study. In the 2.5 years he's been at St. Mary's, he's never asked for more than he needed, never caused trouble, never failed to help when others were in crisis. He's fixed our boiler at least a dozen times, counseled men who were struggling with addiction, and shared his meals with people who had even less than he did. But what do you know about his background, his life before he came to you? Father. Miguel's weathered face creased with compassion. I know he loved his wife deeply enough to sacrifice everything for her medical care. I know he carries her memory like a sacred trust. I know that losing her in his home nearly broke him, but he never became bitter or blamed God for his circumstances. James found himself wanting to believe, but Victoria's warnings echoed in his mind. Could he have fabricated his story? Created false documents or coached people to vouch for him? Mr. Whitmore, Father Miguel said gently, I've worked with homeless individuals for 15 years. I've seen every kind of con artist, manipulator, and desperate person you can imagine. Thomas Mitchell is none of those things. He's a man who's known real love and real loss, and those experiences have made him genuinely good. While James spoke with Father Miguel, Thomas sat in Sophia's school cafeteria, waiting for her to finish her classes. She'd insisted he come for lunch, and he'd agreed despite his discomfort with the curious stares and whispered conversations of other parents. The story of the homeless hero had made national news, and his presence at the exclusive private school had not gone unnoticed. You're him, aren't you? A woman approached his table, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her manicured hands. The man who saved the Whitmore girl. Thomas nodded uncomfortably. Yes, ma'am. That was very brave, she said, but her tone suggested she found something unseemly about his continued presence in their world. Are you planning to stay in the area long? Before Thomas could answer, Sophia appeared at his elbow, her face bright with excitement. Mr. Thomas, you came. Did you bring the pictures of the greenhouse? Right here, Thomas said, pulling out his phone with obvious relief at the interruption. He documented the restoration process step by step, knowing Sophia would want to share their progress with her classmates. As they looked at the photos together, other children gathered around, fascinated by the transformation from broken structure to thriving garden space. Thomas found himself relaxing as he answered their questions about plants and growing things, his natural warmth overcoming his social anxiety. Are you Sophia's grandfather? One little boy asked with the directness of childhood. Thomas glanced at Sophia, unsure how to answer. They'd never officially defined their relationship, though it felt as natural as family. He's my angel, man, Sophia said proudly. He saved my life, and now he takes care of me and Daddy. The simplicity of her explanation silenced the children's questions, but Thomas could feel the weight of adult skepticism from the parents who'd gathered nearby. He was an anomaly in their world, too poor to belong, too integral to Sophia's happiness to dismiss. That afternoon brought a call from Frank Rodriguez, Thomas's former colleague at Riverside Manufacturing. James had contacted him to verify the details in the investigator's report, and Frank had offered to drive up from Pennsylvania to speak in person. Tom was the best supervisor I ever worked for, Frank told James and Victoria, who'd insisted on being present for the interview. Fair, honest, never played favorites. When my wife was sick, he covered my shifts without being asked. When younger, guys made mistakes. You taught them how to fix things instead of writing them up. What about his financial situation? Victoria asked. Were you aware of his wife's medical expenses? Frank's expression grew somber. Margaret's cancer was devastating for both of them. Tom never talked about money. That wasn't his way, but we all knew he was struggling. He started working weekends, picked up every overtime shift available. Word got around that he'd mortgaged his house, cashed out his retirement. Some of the guys tried to help, but Tom was too proud to take charity. So you witnessed his financial decline firsthand? I watched the good man lose everything trying to save the woman he loved, Frank said firmly. And I watched him keep his dignity through it all. Never complained, never asked for pity, just kept working and hoping. The interviews continued through the afternoon. Dr. Shara Chun, Margaret's oncologist, confirmed the treatment timeline and costs. Robert Hayes, the mortgage officer who'd handled the foreclosure, spoke about Thomas's desperate attempts to negotiate payment plans. Each conversation painted the same picture: a man of integrity who'd made impossible choices with grace and determination. But it was the final interview that broke through Victoria's skepticism. Mary Beth Stevens had been Margaret's best friend, and she'd driven 4 hours from Pittsburgh to share her memories of the Mitchell marriage. They were devoted to each other in a way that made you believe in love, she told James and Victoria, tears in her eyes. Margaret used to say that Tom saw her as perfect, even when she was bald from chemo and weak from treatments. He never left her side during the final months, slept in hospital chairs, fed her ice chips when she couldn't keep anything else down. What happened after she died? James asked gently. Tom was lost, Mary Beth said. I tried to get him to move in with my family, offered to help with the medical bills, but he was too proud. He said Margaret had died fighting, and he owed it to her memory to keep fighting too. I think he saw losing the house as his failure, not as the inevitable result of impossible circumstances. Victoria leaned forward. Did he ever mention the Whitmore family? Express any interest in wealthy families or their children? Mary Beth looked confused by the question. Tom barely knew who the president was, let alone wealthy families in New York. He lived in a small town, worked at the same factory for 26 years, and spent his free time taking care of Margaret. The idea that he would have researched or targeted anyone is absurd. But after he became homeless, he disappeared, Mary Beth interrupted. I tried to find him for months after the foreclosure, called shelters, posted on social media, drove through areas where homeless people gathered. It was like he'd vanished from the world entirely. When I saw him on the news saving that little girl, it was the first time I'd seen or heard from him in over 2 years. The weight of evidence was overwhelming. Every person who'd known Thomas before his fall spoke of his character with consistent admiration. The financial records showed a clear progression from stability to sacrifice to loss. The timeline eliminated any possibility of elaborate planning or manipulation. That evening, James found Thomas in the greenhouse, teaching Sophia how to identify different types of plant diseases. The little girl was absorbed in examining leaves. Through a magnifying glass, her scientific curiosity engaged by Thomas's patient explanations. "Daddy," she called when she saw him. "Mr. Thomas is showing me how plants get sick and how to make them better. Did you know some bugs are actually good for gardens?" "I did not know that," James said, his voice carefully neutral. Thomas looked up from the plant he was examining, his expression cautious. He'd spent the day knowing that his life was being dissected by strangers, that every claim he'd made was being verified or challenged. The strain showed in the lines around his eyes, the careful way he moved, as if bracing for rejection. "How did it go?" Thomas asked quietly. "Everyone spoke very highly of you," James replied. "Father Miguel, your former colleagues, your wife's friends and doctors. The evidence all supports your story." Relief flickered across Thomas's face, but he didn't relax entirely. "And your sister? Is she satisfied?" James hesitated. Victoria had left the estate an hour ago, finally convinced of Thomas's authenticity, but not entirely comfortable with his continued presence. Her parting words had been a warning. Just because he's genuine doesn't mean this arrangement is wise. "James, you're creating a dependency that could hurt everyone involved." "She's concerned about the future," James said carefully. "About what happens if this arrangement doesn't work out long term?" Sophia looked up from her plants, sensing the adult tension that seemed to follow discussions about Thomas's place in their family. "What arrangement?" she asked. "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart," Thomas said gently, but his voice carried a note of resignation that made James's chest tighten. That night, James sat in his study with Elena's journal open before him, rereading her hopes for Sophia's future. On the page before him, Elena had written about her fears for their daughter growing up without extended family, without the wisdom and unconditional love that grandparents could provide. "I want Sophia to know she's part of something bigger than just the two of us," Elena had written. "I want her to have someone who will love her completely, who will teach her that family isn't just about blood, but about choice and commitment and showing up when it matters most." The words seemed prophetic now, written by a woman who couldn't have known that her daughter would one day find exactly the kind of grandfather figure Elena had dreamed of in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Sophia stood in the doorway in her pajamas, clutching a piece of paper. "I made something for school," she said, climbing into his lap. "We have to do a presentation about heroes, and I picked Mr. Thomas." James looked at the paper she'd handed him, a school project titled My Hero, with Sophia's careful writing describing Thomas's rescue, his character, and his importance in her life. But it was the drawing that took his breath away, a simple sketch of 3 figures holding hands, labeled Daddy, Me, and Grandpa Thomas. "This is beautiful, sweetheart," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Tell me about your presentation." "I'm going to tell everyone how Mr. Thomas jumped in the cold water to save me, even though he didn't know who I was, and how he fixes things that are broken and makes sad places beautiful again, and how he helps Daddy not be so worried all the time. He does that." Sophia nodded seriously. "Before Mr. Thomas came, you used to look scared when you thought I wasn't watching, like you were afraid something bad would happen to me too. But now you smile more because you know someone else loves me and will take care of me." The inside of children never ceased to amaze James. Sophia had seen something he'd barely acknowledged to himself, that Thomas's presence had lifted a burden of anxiety from his shoulders, allowing him to be a father instead of just a protector. "Do you love Mr. Thomas?" James asked gently. "Like a grandpa," Sophia said without hesitation. "And he loves me like a granddaughter. I can tell because of how he looks at me, like I'm the most important thing in the world." "And what if someday Mr. Thomas had to go away? What if he couldn't stay with us anymore?" Sophia's face crumpled with fear and confusion. "Why would he go away? Did I do something wrong?" "No, baby, you didn't do anything wrong. I just want to make sure you understand that sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions." "No," Sophia said firmly, surprising him with the strength in her voice. "Mr. Thomas wouldn't leave unless you made him. He told me that families stick together, that love means never giving up on people who matter to you." She slid off his lap and stood facing him with 8-year-old determination. "Daddy, you can't make him go away. He belongs with us now. Mommy would want him to stay." The certainty in her voice, the mature understanding of love and commitment that Thomas had somehow taught her, made James realize that his daughter had already solved the equation he'd been struggling with. The mathematical precision that had made him successful in business was useless when it came to matters of the heart. "You're right," he said softly. "Family does stick together." The relief on Sophia's face was immediate and total. She threw her arms around his neck, holding him tight. "Thank you, Daddy. I was scared you were going to send my grandpa away." As James tucked his daughter into bed that night, he made a decision that had nothing to do with investigations or verification or his sister's concerns. Thomas Mitchell had become part of their family not through planning or manipulation, but through love. The kind of deep, sacrificial love that had defined his marriage to Margaret, and now extended to a little girl who'd needed exactly what he had to offer. Tomorrow, James would make it official. But tonight, he simply held his daughter close and listened to Margaret Mitchell's music box playing Elena's favorite song, the sound carrying through the house like a benediction, like a promise that broken things could be repaired, and that Love, in all its forms, would find a way to heal. The charity gala invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, embossed with gold lettering that announced the Children's Hospital Foundation annual benefit. James held the card in his hands, knowing it represented both an opportunity and a test. The event would be Thomas's formal introduction to New York society, a chance to present him not as the homeless hero of sensational headlines, but as a valued member of the Whitmore family. "You don't have to do this," James told Thomas as they stood in the master bedroom, where a custom-tailored tuxedo hung waiting. "I can make our excuses, say you're not ready for this kind of public appearance." Thomas examined his reflection in the full-length mirror, hardly recognizing the man looking back at him. The past month of regular meals and peaceful sleep had filled out his face, and the expensive haircut James had insisted upon had transformed his appearance from vagrant to distinguished gentleman. But beneath the surface changes, he was still the same man who'd learned to make himself invisible on city streets. "Sophia's excited about it," Thomas said, adjusting the unfamiliar bow tie. "She's been practicing her curtsy and asking if she can introduce me to her friend's grandparents." "And what did you tell her?" "That I'd be honored to meet them." Thomas turned from the mirror, his expression serious. "James, I know what tonight represents. Your social circle, your business associates. Everyone who matters in your world will be watching to see if the homeless man belongs among them." "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," James said firmly. "You've already proven everything that matters to me and Sophia." But Thomas understood the unspoken pressures better than James realized. The guest house might have sheltered him from media attention, but he'd seen the photographs in society magazines, read the speculation about James Whitmore's mysterious houseguest. Tonight would either legitimize his place in their family or expose him as an outsider trying to fit into a world where he didn't belong. Sophia burst through the bedroom door in a flutter of pink silk and excitement, her formal dress making her look older than her 8 years. She stopped short when she saw Thomas in his tuxedo, her eyes wide with admiration. "Mr. Thomas, you look like a prince," she exclaimed, then corrected herself with the seriousness of childhood. "No, you look like a grandfather. My grandfather." The possessive pride in her voice made both men smile, but Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was no longer just representing himself tonight. He was representing Sophia's choice, her belief that he belonged in her world permanently. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," Thomas told her, offering his arm with courtly formality. "May I have the honor of escorting you to the car?" The ballroom at the Plaza Hotel glittered with crystal chandeliers and the jewelry of New York's elite. Thomas felt overwhelmed by the opulence, the casual display of wealth that would have fed everyone at St. Mary's Shelter for a year. But Sophia's hand in his kept him grounded, reminded him why he was there. "There's Mrs. Hamilton," Sophia whispered, pointing to an elderly woman draped in pearls. "She has the meanest dog in the park, but Daddy says we have to be nice to her because she gives lots of money to sick children." Thomas suppressed a smile at her innocent assessment of social politics. "Then we'll be extra nice to her." The evening began smoothly enough. James moved through the crowd with practiced ease, introducing Thomas to business associates and family friends with careful explanations about his heroic rescue of Sophia. Most people responded with polite interest, shaking Thomas's hand and offering congratulations on his bravery while their eyes assessed his clothes, his posture, his worthiness to stand among them. But it was the moment when Sophia took the microphone that everything changed. "Excuse me," her small voice carried through the ballroom sound system, causing conversations to fade into curious silence. She stood on the stage beside the evening's master of ceremonies, holding the microphone with both hands, her face serious, with purpose. "I'm Sophia Whitmore, and I wanted to tell you about my grandfather." A murmur rippled through the crowd. James felt his breath catch, uncertain what his daughter planned to say, but knowing it would be completely honest, regardless of consequences. Most of you know about how Mr. Thomas saved me from drowning, Sophia continued, her voice gaining confidence. But I want to tell you about all the other ways he saves people every day. Thomas felt hundreds of eyes turn toward him, the weight of scrutiny from people whose approval could make or break his acceptance into their world. He wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor rather than face whatever innocent revelations Sophia was about to share. "My grandfather fixes broken things," Sophia said, her voice clear and proud. "He fixed my mommy's music box that played her favorite song, and he fixed our greenhouse that was sad and empty, and he fixed my daddy's heart that was too scared to be happy again." The ballroom was completely silent now, every person focused on the little girl speaking with such earnest conviction about love and family and the ways people heal each other. "Before Mr. Thomas came to live with us, I used to have nightmares about losing Daddy like I lost Mommy. But now I know that families take care of each other, that love makes people braver and stronger and better. My grandfather taught me that heroes don't wear capes or have special powers. They just love people enough to jump in cold water when someone needs help." Thomas felt tears threatening as Sophia's words washed over him. She was describing a man he barely recognized, someone worthy of admiration, someone who'd made a difference in the world through simple acts of caring. "I made a school project about heroes," Sophia continued, "and I picked my grandfather because he shows me every day that being good is more important than being rich, that helping people is more important than helping yourself, and that families are made from love, not just from blood." She looked directly at Thomas then, her smile radiant with affection and pride. "Thank you for saving my life, Grandpa Thomas. But mostly, thank you for teaching me how to save other people's lives too, just by loving them." The applause began slowly, a few people clapping politely for the charming child's speech. But as Sophia's words settled into the hearts of parents and grandparents throughout the ballroom, the applause grew stronger, more genuine. Thomas felt the crowd's energy shift from curiosity to appreciation, from judgment to acceptance. James found his way to the stage, lifting Sophia into his arms as she beamed with satisfaction at her successful presentation. He looked out at the assembled crowd, many of whom he'd known for years, but who were seeing his family with new eyes. "My daughter has always been wiser than her father," James said into the microphone, his voice thick with emotion. Thomas Mitchell didn't just save Sophia's life that day by the river. He saved mine too, by showing me what it means to put family first, to love without conditions, and to find purpose in service to others. He paused, looking directly at Thomas, who stood frozen with overwhelming emotion in the crowd below. "Thomas, would you join us up here? There's something I've been meaning to ask you." Thomas felt the crowd part around him as he made his way to the stage, his legs unsteady with nerves and anticipation. Whatever James planned to do, it would happen in front of everyone who mattered in their social circle, making it impossible to take back or ignore. "Thomas Mitchell," James said formally, his voice carrying through the silent ballroom, "you've given my daughter something I couldn't provide, a grandfather's unconditional love. Wisdom earned through a lifetime of experiences, and the security that comes from knowing someone will always be there to catch her when she falls." Thomas saw James reach into his jacket pocket, withdrawing a folded document that looked official and important. "You've also given me something I thought I'd lost forever, the ability to trust someone else with my daughter's well-being, to share the responsibility and joy of raising her. Sophia was right when she said you fixed my heart. You reminded me that family isn't limited by biology, that love expands to include whoever chooses to stay and serve and sacrifice." James held up the papers for the crowd to see. "These are guardianship documents, Thomas. Legal papers making you Sophia's official grandfather, giving you all the rights and responsibilities that come with that role. The question is, will you accept The ballroom fell into absolute silence, hundreds of people holding their breath as Thomas stood frozen on the stage. The guardianship papers trembled in James's outstretched hand, representing everything Thomas had lost when Margaret died and everything he'd found in saving Sophia's life. His fingers moved unconsciously to the chain around his neck, feeling Margaret's wedding ring through the fabric of his dress shirt. For 3 years, that ring had been his only connection to the man he used to be, someone who mattered, someone who was loved, someone who had a place in the world. Now James was offering him something he'd never dared to hope for: legal recognition, that he belonged to this family, that his love for Sophia was real and permanent and protected by law. Thomas began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. In the silence, he could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every eye in the room watching his response. Sophia wiggled out of her father's arms and took Thomas's hand, her small fingers intertwining with his weathered ones. "Say, yes, Grandpa," she whispered, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Say yes so everyone knows you're mine forever." The innocence of her plea broke through Thomas's paralysis. He looked down at this little girl who'd called him her angel man, who'd trusted him completely from the moment he pulled her from the icy river. She'd never seen him as homeless or broken or unworthy. She'd simply seen him as the grandfather she needed, the missing piece of her family puzzle. "Yes," Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper. Then, stronger. "Yes, I accept." The emotion that had been building in his chest for weeks finally broke free. Tears streamed down his face as he knelt to Sophia's level, pulling her into his arms. She held him tight, her own eyes bright with happy tears. "I love you, Grandpa Thomas," she said, against his shoulder. "I love you too, sweetheart," he replied, his voice thick with gratitude and wonder. "More than you'll ever know." James stepped forward, placing the official papers in Thomas's free hand. "Then it's official," he said, his own voice emotional. "Welcome to the family, Thomas, permanently." The applause that erupted was different this time, not polite society clapping, but genuine appreciation for a moment of authentic love and commitment. Many in the crowd were parents themselves, grandparents who understood the profound bond being formalized on the stage before them died as the evening progressed. Thomas found himself surrounded by people who wanted to congratulate him, to share their own stories of family and adoption, and the ways love transcends biology. The skepticism he'd expected was largely absent, replaced by warmth and acceptance from people who'd witnessed something genuinely moving. "You know," said Mrs. Hamilton, the elderly woman with the supposedly mean dog, "I've attended these charity events for 40 years, and I've never seen anything more beautiful than what just happened on that stage. That little girl is lucky to have you." Thomas felt overwhelmed by the kindness, by the realization that his fears about being rejected by James's social circle had been largely unfounded. These people understood family, understood love, understood the courage it took to open your heart to someone who needed what you had to offer. Later, as the evening wound down, Thomas found himself on the hotel's terrace with James, looking out over the city lights. Sophia had fallen asleep in her father's arms, exhausted by excitement and the late hour. "Are you sure about this?" Thomas asked quietly. "The guardianship papers, making it legal. You can't take it back if you change your mind." "I don't want to take it back," James replied firmly. "Thomas, you've given me my daughter back. Before you came into our lives, Sophia was surviving but not thriving. She was so afraid of losing me that she couldn't fully live. Now she's confident and happy and secure because she knows she has 2 people who love her unconditionally. But your sister, your family, they'll have opinions about this decision." James shifted Sophia gently in his arms. "Victoria's already called to congratulate us. She was watching the live stream from her hotel room, and she said Sophia's speech made her cry." Even she can't argue with what she saw tonight, a little girl who's found her grandfather, and a man who's found his purpose. Thomas looked down at the legal papers in his hands, still hardly believing they were real. I never thought I'd have a family again after Margaret died. I assumed that part of my life was over. Maybe that's why you were so ready to jump in the river, James suggested. Maybe you recognized something in Sophia that you needed to a reason to keep living, keep fighting, keep caring about tomorrow. The insight was profound and probably true. Thomas had been existing rather than living for 3 years, going through the motions of survival without real hope for the future. But Sophia had given him purpose again, had reminded him that he still had something valuable to offer the world. What happens now? Thomas asked. Now we go home, James said simply. We put Sophia to bed. We make breakfast together in the morning. And we figure out this family thing one day at a time. Just like we've been doing, except now it's official. As they prepared to leave the hotel, Thomas caught sight of his reflection in the lobby mirrors. The man looking back at him bore little resemblance to the broken individual who'd sat on a park bench drinking shelter coffee just months earlier. This man stood straight, wore expensive clothes with dignity, and carried himself like someone who knew he was valued and loved. But more than the external changes, Thomas could see something different in his eyes. Hope, purpose, the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you belong somewhere. Margaret's ring still hung around his neck, but it no longer felt like the weight of loss. Instead, it had become a bridge between the love he'd known and the love he'd found. A reminder that the heart's capacity for caring never diminishes, only expands. In the car on the way home, Sophia stirred in her sleep and reached for Thomas's hand. Even unconscious, she seemed to need the reassurance of his presence, the security that came from knowing her grandfather was there to keep her safe. Thank you, James said quietly as they drove through the city streets toward home. For what? For jumping, for staying, for loving her the way you do, for showing me that family isn't something you're born into. It's something you choose every day. Thomas squeezed Sophia's sleeping hand gently, feeling the truth of James's words settle into his heart. He'd spent 3 years believing his story was over, that the best parts of his life were behind him. But sitting in that car with his new family, holding legal papers that made their bond official, Thomas realized his story was just beginning a new chapter. The homeless man who'd jumped into the Hudson River to save a drowning child had found something more valuable than rescue. He'd found redemption, purpose, and a love that would last the rest of his days. 6 months after the charity gala, Thomas stood in the completed greenhouse, watching Sophia carefully water the tomato plants they'd grown from seeds. The morning sun streamed through the pristine glass panels, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the thriving garden. The space had been transformed from Elena's abandoned dream into something new, still honoring her memory, but alive with fresh purpose and shared joy. The tomatoes are getting fat, Grandpa, Sophia announced, her voice filled with the satisfaction of successful cultivation. Do you think they'll be ready for Daddy's birthday? I think they'll be perfect timing, Thomas replied, adjusting the watering schedule chart they'd created together. Everything in the greenhouse was methodical, organized with the precision he'd learned in his factory days, but tempered with the patience gardening required. Their morning routine had become sacred. Thomas would wake at dawn, some habits never changed, and prepare coffee in his kitchen before walking the grounds in the peaceful early light. Sophia would join him by 8, usually still in her pajamas, chattering about her dreams and plans for the day. They'd check on their plants, tend to whatever needed attention, and share breakfast in the greenhouse's small sitting area while discussing everything from school projects to philosophy. Mrs. Patterson asked if I wanted to do another presentation about heroes, Sophia said, settling beside him on the garden bench. But I told her I already did the best one about you. Thomas smiled, remembering the school project that had started as a simple assignment and ended up changing how he saw himself. Sophia's unwavering belief in his heroism had gradually convinced him that maybe jumping into the river had been the beginning of his redemption, rather than a desperate act by a man with nothing left to lose. "Maybe you could pick a different kind of hero this time," he suggested. "What about your daddy? He's pretty heroic in his own way." "Daddy's a business hero," Sophia said matter-of-factly. "He makes things better for lots of people with his computers. But you're a heart hero. You make people feel better inside." The distinction made Thomas chuckle, but he recognized the truth in her 8-year-old wisdom. James had found his calling in technology and innovation, solving problems on a massive scale. Thomas's gifts were smaller, more personal, fixing broken music boxes, restoring abandoned greenhouses, helping wounded hearts remember how to hope. Through the greenhouse windows, he could see the main house where James was probably already at his desk, managing the empire that allowed them all to live in comfort. But wealth, Thomas had learned, wasn't what made their family work. It was the daily choice to show up for each other, to put family needs above individual desires, to love without conditions or reservations. The foundation they'd established in Margaret's memory had become Thomas's favorite project. The Margaret Mitchell Memorial Fund provided support for families facing medical bankruptcy, helping them navigate the impossible choices Thomas had once faced alone. Every month, he and James reviewed applications from people whose stories echoed his own: loving spouses emptying savings accounts, mortgaging homes, sacrificing everything for a chance to save the person they loved most. "We helped a Johnson family this month," Thomas told Sophia as they worked together repotting orchids. "Remember, I told you about the little boy with leukemia? His treatments are working, and his parents won't lose their house. Because of Grandma Margaret's fund? Because people like your daddy understand that love shouldn't bankrupt families, that hope shouldn't come with a price tag." Sophia nodded seriously, absorbing lessons about generosity and justice that would shape her character for life. Thomas marveled at how naturally she'd accepted the concept of using wealth to help others, how seamlessly she'd integrated his values of service with her father's resources. Father Miguel visited every few weeks, bringing news from St. Mary's, shelter and updates on the people Thomas had known during his years on the streets. The priest had become part of their extended family, blessing their meals when he stayed for dinner, offering counseling when old grief surfaced unexpectedly, serving as a bridge between Thomas's past and present. "Danny's been sober for 4 months, Father Miguel had reported during his last visit. "He's working part-time at the warehouse district, living in transitional housing. He asked me to tell you that your example, seeing you find a family and a home, gives him hope that his story isn't over either." Those updates meant more to Thomas than all the society page mentions or charity recognition. Knowing that his transformation had inspired other broken people to keep fighting, to believe in second chances, gave his current happiness a deeper meaning. The music box sat on Sophia's dresser, its ballerina still spinning to Elena's favorite melody each night before bedtime. But now the sound brought comfort rather than pain, had become part of the healing soundtrack of their reconstructed family. Thomas had repaired dozens of small items around the estate: clocks, appliances, toys that had been forgotten in storage. Each successful fix reminded him that broken didn't mean worthless, that most things could be restored with patience and the right touch. Victoria had surprised everyone by becoming one of Thomas's strongest supporters. Her initial skepticism had given way to grudging respect, then genuine affection for the man who'd brought such joy to her brother's family. She'd even started bringing her own grandchildren to visit, letting them explore the greenhouse and learn about plants from someone who understood that teaching was an act of love. "You've changed, James," she told Thomas during her last visit. "He's more relaxed now, more present with Sophia. He used to parent out of fear, afraid he'd fail her the way he felt he'd failed Elena by not preventing the accident. But watching how you love Sophia, how you trust her to grow and learn and sometimes get hurt, has taught him that good parenting isn't about preventing all pain. It's about being there to help heal when pain inevitably comes. The observation had touched Thomas deeply because he'd seen the change too. James was more patient now, more willing to let Sophia take age-appropriate risks, more confident in his role as her father. The desperate protectiveness born from loss had softened into loving guidance, creating space for Sophia to develop independence, while knowing she was cherished, that their evening routine had become as treasured as their mornings. After dinner, they'd often sit in the living room while Sophia did homework, Thomas helping with projects that required patience and James tackling assignments that needed technical knowledge. Then came stories sometimes from Thomas's childhood, sometimes from James's business adventures, always from Sophia's endlessly creative imagination. Tell the one about the dragon who didn't know he was actually a prince, Sophia would request, curl between them on the sofa. But you know how it ends, Thomas would protest gently. I know, but I like hearing you tell it. Your voice makes it more real. These moments of ordinary family intimacy still amaze Thomas. For years, he'd believed such simple pleasures were forever beyond his reach. Now they formed the foundation of his days, the reason he woke up eager to see what small joys awaited. The plaque outside the renovated greenhouse caught the afternoon light, its brass letters gleaming against the stone wall. The Margaret Mitchell Memorial Greenhouse, where broken things grow beautiful again. James had commissioned it as a surprise for Thomas's first official Father's Day, recognizing that the space had become a symbol of everything their family represented: healing, growth, the transformation that happens when love is given freely and received gratefully. As evening approached, Thomas and Sophia finished their garden tasks and walked hand in hand toward the main house, where James would be ending his workday and beginning his favorite hours as a father and friend. The routine was comfortable now, natural as breathing, but Thomas never took it for granted. At the river park, where his old bench still sat, other homeless individuals gathered each day, some facing the same desperation Thomas had known, others managing to maintain hope despite impossible circumstances. He visited regularly, bringing sandwiches and coffee, but more importantly bringing his story proof that endings could become beginnings, that the worst chapters didn't have to be the final ones. The thing about rock bottom, he'd tell anyone willing to listen, is that it gives you a solid foundation to build on. I thought saving that little girl was the end of my story, the last good thing I'd ever do. Instead, it was the beginning of the best part of my life. Tonight, as every night for the past 6 months, Thomas would pull out Margaret's photograph before sleep, telling her about his day, sharing his gratitude for the unexpected gift of family he'd found. Her wedding ring still hung around his neck, but its meaning had evolved. No longer just a reminder of love lost, it had become a symbol of love's ability to multiply, to expand beyond what seemed possible. Sophia's laughter drifted through the guest house windows as she played in the garden, a joy, a daily testament to the healing power of belonging. James's voice joined hers, father and daughter sharing some private joke that would become another treasured memory. Thomas smiled, remembering the question that had brought him to this moment. Could a man who had lost everything find the family he never knew he needed? The answers surrounded him in every direction, in the restored greenhouse, in the child's trust, in the father's friendship, in the community they built from love and choice and daily commitment. Some people believe we're all just one moment away from losing everything. Thomas Mitchell had learned that we're also just one moment away from finding everything we never dared to hope for. Sometimes salvation comes in the form of jumping into cold water to save a stranger. Sometimes it comes in the form of letting yourself be saved in return. The homeless man who'd sat on a park bench nursing bitter coffee had become a grandfather, A friend, a pillar of strength for people who needed what he'd learned about survival and hope. His story had ended and begun in the same moment, in the space between hearing a child scream and choosing to answer it. And every morning, as he walked the grounds of his new home with the sun painting the sky in shades of possibility, Thomas Mitchell knew that the best stories, the ones worth living and sharing and cherishing, are about the moment when we stop merely surviving and start truly living again.